Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am here with Inez Stepman. I'm going to have Inez introduce herself first, and then we're going to run through some doom and some optimism with regard to women's issues, feminism, the family, dating, all that fun stuff. So welcome. And why don't you introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. I'm Inez Stepman, and by the way, it's nice to speak to somebody who clearly speaks Spanish because of the way that you said my name. So my name's Inez Stepman, and I work for an outlet called the Independent Women's Forum. We are a small think tank, and our whole kind of concept is that all issues are women's issues. So we work on economic issues, we work on foreign policy. In my particular little batch of issues includes education policy, which I've worked on for a long time, alongside a lot of issues of the definition of sex, a lot of legal issues pulling in surrounding the definition of sex, and just various cultural items. So that's what I do.
Let's start by talking about girl boss feminism.
I almost feel like I was just talking to Helen Roy about this on my own podcast, and I almost feel like it's kicking a dead horse at this point. I do think that a certain type of girl boss feminism kind of died, and the last, as Helen says, the last nail in the coffin, I think, was COVID, when a lot of people realized that actually without the social element, without the churn and the distraction, it's a very lonely life. To the girl boss life is a lonely one. Mm-hmm. And so I think there were already a lot of signs that this archetype was passing from its primacy in our culture. I don't know whether what replaces it will actually be constructive or not, but it does seem like this is not something that young women, at least aesthetically, aspire to. And I don't know if the critique is deeper or just aesthetic at this point, but I think at least aesthetically this is kind of cringy, and nobody under the age of 25 wants to grow up to be a girl boss anymore, just because it's kind of awkward and whatever, unpopular. But that doesn't mean that the deeper concepts underlying it, for example, female careerism or fundamental denial of the things that actually make each sex happy, are different. I'm not sure has actually gone anywhere, but at least this archetype, I feel like, has been put to bed.
That's good. I mean, stop jumping to the optimism already.
Peeking it at this point, it's like I feel like you could throw a dart and hit a random Gen Zer and they would have bad things to say about it. So in that sense, our work is done.
That's good. That is good. And yeah, and it is just like a waiting game. In the meantime, though, it seems like there is this both voting block and like set of policy and cultural warriors, like the affluent white female liberal, the AWFL type, that seems to hold quite a bit of cultural power still. So let's talk about this subgroup and some of the things that they advocate for. And I guess to put in context, I was just tweeting yesterday about how I think a little bit about demographic collapse in developed countries does this weird thing where if your society isn't like fundamentally built around reproducing itself, there's all sorts of weird ways in which moralizing forces get turned strange, like you just get these people who more or less are like nihilistic because they have no stake in the future, because they're not really focused that much on like reproducing themselves via children. And then you get all sorts of like caring impulses that turn strange, like turn towards like dog mom culture, and we're going to tell you things about how you have to be in your family type culture. So like I just like your thoughts on this this block of affluent white female liberals, and also like this block of, I guess, like the childless, which the group seems to be increasing, the childless, and especially among the affluent.
Yeah, I mean, so let's start with some actual. The reason I was looking down is I'm looking for the actual poll. So in the recent U.S. midterms, right, married men broke Republican by 20 points, married women by 14, unmarried men broke Republican still by 7 points, but unmarried women broke Democrat by 37
Yeah,
points.
yeah, that's what I
So,
was thinking about.
and I mean, I think we're going to have to confront this as a political force. So if you look at, we're on track, and by we, I mean millennials, we're on track to have the highest proportion, probably, I mean, we can't be sure because obviously we weren't collecting as good statistics before about 100 years ago, or maybe even 150 years ago. But for sure in sort of recorded history, and I would suspect actually potentially in all of human history, we'll have the highest proportion of unmarried and childless women in millennial generation hitting, let's say 40, 45, past the age of even hope of childbearing, right? um, and those have been choices, but there's also clearly some larger forces at play. But regardless of why that is, it's going to, I mean, if I'm more direct about it, I think it's going to wreck our politics, because those women very, very clearly have a totally different set of ideas than the rest of the country, and they have an enormous amount of power.
Yeah.
And this has always been the there's a few major issues I have with feminism, like on a deeper level, or an ideological level, philosophical level, whatever you want to call it. The biggest objection I have is this social construction theory of sex differences,
Right.
which runs all the way back to, I mean, even like Mary Wollstonecraft, right? So we're not just talking Betty Friedan, we're not talking second wave feminism, third, fourth wave feminism. We're talking about the concept of feminism from the beginning has this built-in thing. But the other aspect that I think is so kind of ridiculous, and it's connected, is that I don't really believe that there's ever been a society in human civilization which women are totally powerless. That doesn't mean that they have the same powers as men, and there are societies out there. But the idea that women, like that half the population holds absolutely no power and no control over the future, to me is kind of a simplistic way of looking at it. It's always the wrong lens. I don't think that the oppression oppressor lens fits very well onto male female relations, even in societies that we would describe as deeply misogynistic. There's always some kind of power wielded by women, sometimes limited severely in some places, but also elevated in others. And I just generally don't think this is the right lens to be examining male female relations or marriage or civilization through. But yeah, I think we're going to be dealing with a huge spike of kind of, I mean, any individual person, right, could not be any of these things, but I do think that it's going to be a reaction to loneliness, to regret, and to a certain kind of search for meaning that is going to latch on to political movements. And I don't think that's going to be good for our politics.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think this, I wrote about this a little bit, but I think that this like totalizing victimhood politics is so weird in an era where let's say the less powerful have more power than they had ever in history, like relatively, and then just swinging so far in the direction of like women are totally oppressed makes this extremely oppositional politics, it seems like to me, and makes it so that it's everybody's an enemy, and then the enemy is like so extremely bad, when I think in most of human history women would have less power by today's standards, but they would have a kind of understanding that there was some kind of balance in between the sexes, and a lot of that happened from working together, and that balance looked different in different places, but it like fundamentally you can't, I think something I think about a lot is like you just can't think of other people as the opposite as just fundamentally evil. It makes it impossible to work together. I wonder if you have thoughts too on the opposite side, unmarried men, also seeing women as the enemy. Do you see this phenomenon too?
I mean, yes, but let's start here. There really can't be an ongoing war between the sexes for too long, because of the simple fact that there's too much sleeping with the enemy, right? it's
I love this.
you know this kind of state can't go on. Actually, Simone de Beauvoir, right, lamented this fact about men and women, that she actually said women are the only oppressed class who have no even theoretical hope of victory, because if she points to two other examples, Jews and blacks, and she says each of these groups could theoretically, kill off all of their oppressors, right? And in a great, glorious, genocidal victory.
Yeah.
That women cannot do that to their oppressors, and it makes oppression of women actually worse, because we can never even hope to have victory. So she's lamenting, right, this fact that for the world to continue spinning and the human race to go on, men and women are going to have to find a thawing in the war between the sexes, in some way. And on an individual level, like, people do, right, even despite the I would call it depraved sexual politics of our era, people do find, so I guess that's the optimistic side, but
You're too optimistic. We have to stick in the doom.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not following I'm quite pessimistic about a lot of things.
That's good.
But at the end of the day, right, men and women are really different, but they need each other, and I do. And I'm not a religious person. This is an observation, born of sort of biological reality and just looking around. But yeah, I mean, look, I think unmarried women are asserting themselves more politically, which is kind of bizarre, right? When you think about, so if you think about like polygamous societies, right, harem that are built around a harem, perhaps more natural for human sexuality, right? Hypergamous women are satisfied because they all get to date West Elm Caleb. And which is kind of what we're returning to, I think, with dating apps, like, but in any case, a harem model, right, where women all essentially marry a handful of high status men, and young men are left out in the cold and can't find wives. Those societies have to be nomadic, and have to have a lot of warfare, and have to find a way to deal with the excess male problem, right? It seems to me that we've dealt with it by like almost doping or desensitizing or extra males. Women are hypergamously sleeping with a small percentage of men, and dating app data bears that out. Essentially, the sexual revolution, the winners of the sexual revolution were essentially a small percentage of men, at the top of the spectrum. The sort of kind of losers are women, and then the real losers of the sexual revolution are the bottom half of men who are not pairing up with women at all. And I think, does that develop a certain kind of resentment? Yes, of course it does. Can it become sort of embittered? Yeah, of course it can be. I mean, my sort of break with the manosphere, I agree with, like, I was an early reader of Chateau Heartiste. I don't know if I should admit that, but I think they had a lot of important things to say that were very contrary to the narrative, and actually explain sex dynamics in society much better than the prevailing narrative. The part where element that's complaining about the fact that, like, overweight women in their 40s or whatever are not competitive 23-year-old, right? As sort of neutral and just a fact of life is the fact that men like young, fertile, beautiful women, right? It's just the reality of sexual polarity of our biology. And there's not really a point in railing against it. So that's really where I part ways. I think that's a kind of unproductive bitterness among unmarried men. But in terms of, I think they're much less likely in our society to, I don't know, usually you would think that an excess of men not getting laid, young men not getting laid, means that stuff starts burning. That would be one sort of outlet, but it seems like instead we're keeping people satiated with porn and with you know,
I
a
would add
bunch of other
video
life
games.
substitutes, not just porn, but yeah, that was also on my list. Like video games give you a sense of like accomplishing tasks, right? You know, porn obviously satisfies a certain level of sexual impulse. Like we now have, you know, there's various drugs one can dope oneself with, legal and illegal. I think that's more, we were heading towards more of a Brave New World type future, a way of dealing with essentially men who aren't doing well in these in this hypergamous essentially environment, dating environment. I don't know if that's better or worse. I mean, obviously I don't want things to burn, but I also at least when you have that pressure in society, something eventually kind of has to change. It seems more like young men are dropping out and they're not actually causing any pressure to change on the system, because they're just kind of quietly, they're living lives that to me sound quite miserable. Here I'm thinking about the NEETs, actually, the neither education or training. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's the UK designation. In America, it's simply not in neither working nor in education or training, right? So they're men who are chronically unemployed in the prime years of their life. That number is going up and up and up and up. You know, I think that's more a picture. And Nicholas Eberstadt has a great update on his book on sort of the demographic features of these men. And one of them is that they're actually spending the equivalent of a workday on of one type or another. The surveys don't indicate, but 40, 50 hours a week on essentially entertainment and screens. And I think that's really, that is the sector of men that are sort of dropping out, right? I think that's more what's going to happen than cars burning in the streets.
Yeah, and this is something that's really
how's that for depressing?
Yeah, yeah, that's perfect. And this is something I've been kind of confused by, and I don't know if you know the statistics on this at all, but it seems like unmarried women are politically active and they're shaping the political landscape to their will. It seems like unmarried men aren't, and I don't understand and maybe you can help me understand. It seems like they're not using any of their frustration to like knock doors or like get their candidates elected. Is there just like a kind of burn it all down nihilism with this demographic? Like I'm just curious, do you see that these young unmarried men are not politically participating? Is that true? That's just a sense I have, and is there some explanation for that?
Yeah, I think there's exactly the divergence you're pointing to. I think unmarried women are participating very aggressively in politics as as a source of meaning, and there is dedication from young women, and then especially as they get older, and if they don't marry or have children, this becomes a source of meaning for them. Men, I think, are really dropping out in the same situation. I think they're, what we just talked about, they're spending their time on screens, or they're even if they do have a job, they're sort of not they're not girl bossing, they're not boy bossing, whatever you want to call it. They're actually just kind of dropping out. But the kind of political choices of women overall who fall into that category are in my view, like just really depressing and devastating and tyrannical, right? I think if we can amend Orwell a little bit, it's almost like the vision, instead of the jackboot on the human face forever, it's like a sensible work heel on our face forever. Like it's the primacy of sort of the HR sort of mentality, which is in some way feminine and can be good, but not applied in this way, right? Like women's sort of attention to relationship detail, to kind of setting rules of social order, which is usually women's job, right? That used to be directed in much more productive ways. And by the way, the corresponding collapse in the private sphere and in civic society, I increasingly think is because women essentially went to work. Because there used to be a rule, even if, let's say, you didn't have children, you didn't marry, there used to be a lot more volunteerism. At least I can't speak for the whole world, but in America, there used to be a lot more volunteerism among women. And now that's political, right? Instead of being somebody who starts like, a charity kitchen, or who, for example, if you look at any American small town, you'll find, at least those that haven't been torn down, if you find like statues that have been raised in the town square, if you look to the side, there's usually a plaque that says this statue was commissioned and raised by the women of X small town, right? This group or that group, the Daughters of the Revolution, whatever it is, right? It's usually women's groups that build that kind of stuff. And instead of putting their energy into that, now that same woman works for an NGO, right? That's part of the kind of NGO, whatever government complex, or she works in an agency in the EPA, or in academia. And I just think that's like a much more horrific outlet for that feminine impulse. And it's warped and become tyrannical in the form that it's being expressed. But yeah, I mean, the collapse of a lot of really great things that women essentially did with their time, either when they didn't have young children in the house, or if they didn't end up having children, or they didn't end up marrying, like there were honorable vocations for the spinster. And now I feel like we're going to have an entire generation of spinsters and no role for spinsterhood at all that's productive in society. They're all going to be like heads of HR and make the rest of us miserable.
This reminds me so much of my dissertation research. I think there's actually just a ton of overlap with environmental issues, but what I'm thinking about right now is women embedded in a community where they see the result of their like sort of caring impulse, or they're interacting with like the world in a real knowable way. They can see the outcome of a caring impulse, like they know the community it's affecting. And I think now it's a sort of disembedded or disembodied caring impulse where, maybe you become some kind of executive at Greenpeace and you think like, I'm helping the environment or something like that. Or, I'm thinking about a lot of these environmentalists who I work with, the poor animals, the poor, like, ecosystems or whatever, I'm going to help them. But in this disembodied way, a lot of those caring impulses just end up being really destructive, because they just are based on what I call spreadsheet brain, which is the way of understanding the world is just through spreadsheets, and you don't understand at all what you're interacting with. And then you end up making these decisions, which are like the opposite of what you actually need to like what you would need to put your caring impulse toward, to make the outcome you actually want. It's sort of the opposite. So it's just this weird melding in my mind now between like the HR girl boss, like feminist caring impulse combined with spreadsheet brain really does yield like a lot of destruction in the world.
Look, we don't admit that there are feminine virtues and masculine virtues, which is not to say that some virtues are not, or most virtues even are not virtues in both sexes. But the same impulse, I think we understand this perfectly, for example, or at least those of us who don't have our brains broken by whatever like woke unreality is popular at the moment. But we understand this about, for example, the impulse to violence among men, right? We understand perfectly that there's a very different, it's very different depending on how it's challenged or channeled, right? Like when we raise men to use that impulse to, you know, fight bad guys, right? Or we raise men to channel that impulse into protecting their wives and children, or protecting those who are unjustly preyed on by others, right? That is an enormously positive impulse. When we channel it towards protecting the civilization and being the you know, the sort of sentinels on the walls of civilization, it's an enormously positive and necessary thing. It ought to be admired and lauded as a virtue. That same impulse is also, you know, the reason that men commit 99% of murders, right? It's also the reason that men are you know, are much overwhelmingly, I mean, to the point of like, when you see a woman doing something like this, right? It's a completely national news story. There's very few female muggers, right? It's not just because women are weaker, right? Theoretically, the gun can overcome the what is it, the great American saying, God made man and woman, but Samuel Colt made them equal. So there are obviously deeply negative sort of outlets for this aggressive impulse in men. I mean, there are plenty of things that are similar for women. The attention that women pay to their relationships and the primacy that they give them is the glue that makes families and civilizations and civic society happen. Mm. It also makes us into gossips, right? Like, it's the same impulse. It's properly channeled or improperly channeled, right? So that's how I feel about that. I mean, like, yes, I think it's improperly channeled into you know, girl bossing at the Sierra Club, when it ought to be more about gathering, yes, and like caring for small animals and stuff, and maybe something more closer to what you do, right? Which is actually the work of running a farm and interacting with animals and interacting with nature in that way, and, you know, kids and other, like the way that you're doing, right? You're that's a very positive thing. But if it's channeled towards writing regulations in the EPA to make, you know, the mostly men who work on ranches in the western part of the United States, to make their lives miserable and make it impossible for them to actually use their ranches because one time a spotted owl was seen like 3 years ago in a tree, and then the army of sort of suited girl bosses descends on these people who actually are working with the land. They understand what's going on with the land. I mean, that's a very bad way to channel that kind of caring impulse.
Yeah, this is great. Okay, so let's turn towards the optimism then. And maybe let's lean on some of the masculine and feminine virtues, and dream about the ways in which they could be I don't know, wielded for something more positive. You and I had a conversation about flirting, and flirting supremacy, and how there's something really lovely and embodied and convivial about a world in which you know, there's I guess just this convivial relationship between the sexes, where you have a sense of figuring out somebody's vibes in person. I wonder, let's talk about that. Let's talk about flirting for a bit.
Yeah, it is really sad, and I keep going back to this anecdote because it really underscores I think what the situation is now, and then we can talk about why that is. I have a friend who's a bartender. She's been bartending for 15 years, and she said even before COVID, right? You know, about 5 years ago, this happened. Men do not approach women in bars. It is extremely rare for that to happen anymore, which blows my mind as like a, you know, 34-year-old millennial who spent, you know, my young 20s in bars getting, you know, bought drinks by men and talking to them, right? Like, this was a very easy way to it wasn't the greatest way to, you know, date with intentionality or whatever, but it definitely happened all the time. And that's gone. And largely the apps have replaced that, and they've replaced it to such an extent that even if, say, a young man would want to approach more women in person, I think it's a much more uphill battle now, right? You always have to. That's the scary thing about being a man, right? In this dance, you have to risk rejection. You have to be willing to be rejected, right? Which also I have something to say about that, like about how rejection is actually much more deep and personal now. But leave that aside. But you have to be, already kind of have to screw up your courage to do this because it involves being rejected by women. And now the percentage chance that you're going to be rejected is much higher because the behavior itself reads as creepy because it doesn't happen, right? So like you're an outlier, and yeah, maybe you're suave enough to make that, work for you, but most men probably aren't, right? Like it just reads as creepier now to young women because they're not like you and I'm sure you're the same way when you were, in your early 20s or whatever. Like you and I were used to the concept of men coming up to us, asking us if they can buy us a drink and like chatting us up. That was a normal thing. You weren't immediately a creep or a weirdo if you did that. Now, there were creeps and weirdos who did that, but there wasn't that immediate impulse.
But then you could pick up the vibes, like if they're a creep or a weirdo, like, okay, no, I'm good, after like some seconds. But just the act of doing it wasn't creepy.
Yeah, I feel like more and more the act of doing it reads, at least up front, as creepy, and you have an uphill battle from there. And so it really is just, people do have to go on the apps because there really isn't a lot happening in person unless I'm a big fan of, I think, house parties might be the way to get out of this, right? At least everybody's kind of pre-vetted by people there. I still think there's something enormously missing in the app culture. I think it plays to our worst instincts. I mentioned before that I think we're essentially returning to a hypergamous state or whatever polygamous state on the apps. It's just serial instead of like the harem is serial instead of contiguous or in time, right? Where it's just 10% of men who are sleeping with the vast majority of women in like succession, offering no commitment because they don't have to. And women are having a series of like bad experiences with men who will never commit to them. And then the other, like, meanwhile, the like other half or 80% even of men on apps are getting like one swipe a week and then one date a year. And the number is out, by the way. That's just like completely dysfunctional, but not in a rooted society where we need people to form families and we're not sending men to war every war season, right? It is not a functional way to get stable families or marriages or children. And that's, that's all, folks, right?
Yeah.
I'll say one more thing. The things that are missed in an app culture are sort of situational alpha moments from men that make women attract to them in person. It turns out 80% of men are not, that women only swipe left on like 20% of men or something. Was it left or right? I've never been on one of these apps.
I don't know.
Whatever. They accept only that the data shows that they basically disregard 80% of men. It's not, you and I observe that that's not the case in person.
No.
Right? Because, a guy who's like comes off as kind of a dullard online on like an app or whatever, when you see him in the bar with his buddies and he's telling jokes and like, buying people around to drinks and like he's having a good time and seems confident, that guy suddenly becomes much more attractive in person to women. You could make this as a negative, like it's also like the camp effect. If this might be something only for people our age, but if you put a bunch of 14 or 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds together, like a guy can become the most attractive guy in the camp merely by like restricting the pool for the summer, right? It's like super attractive. Maybe back home at school he wasn't doing so well with women, but you go to camp and he's just, for whatever reason, that summer he's the guy that all the women want to make out with. In any case, these things are not as like hard and fast as they seem. There is there's a reality to women being attracted to dominant men or to alpha men, but like it's more situational than it's happening on the apps, where it's just a particular kind of guy who's doing really well on this app, whereas in person, I think a much wider swath of men have a better shot than of these two-dimensional.
I
We can
love
also talk about how women are unattractive. I don't want to dump on.
this. Kind of reminds me too, like a lot of people, this is where spreadsheet brain comes into to play again, because I think a lot of people will be swiping based on like height or like statistics almost, of what they see on the page, as opposed to yeah, like these situational dynamics. And I was just thinking, like, what if somebody on paper is like 6'5" and makes this amount of money and blah blah blah, and then you meet him in person, he's got like a terrible voice or is like so not charismatic. Like the opposite effect is true too. Like I think a lot of women are really just sort of tricking themselves into thinking there is like a statistical right or statistical dominant person they should be seeking. And I think it just leaves out a lot of potentiality for for vibes. And I'm thinking about this guy who extended his legs. A lot of guys are having this like leg extension surgery, and it's like swipe culture. Horrible.
Yeah, that's got to be the equivalent of women going into plastic surgery to look like their Instagram filters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's awful. That just sounds like a really terrible surgery to go through. Like I think they break your legs and then stuff something. Anyway, no, I and men will not believe this when we say this. But I really do think it's true. I don't know any woman who has never like had a crush on a guy shorter than her.
Right.
I don't think that. So it's one of those things that if you ask people up front, they will say, yes, I want only guys who are above 6 feet or whatever, right? It's one of those things where when you ask the question, there's a preference, but the preference is actually a soft one, right? You're giving a hard answer, but it's actually completely negotiable based on other factors, but those other factors aren't going to show up when you're setting parameters on like an app, right? So it is one of those, and that's just one example, but I really do think women are much more flexible. First of all, if women don't date short guys, why is every supermodel dating some guy and people will say like, okay, they're very rich or whatever. Yeah, but she's a supermodel. Okay. So,
she could get a hot and rich guy probably.
Yeah. So I think that's one of those things that's a soft preference, that if you ask people you ask women what they prefer, they generally say, yes, I prefer tall men. I think that's actually quite natural in the sense that women like to feel like the smaller ones. They feel small and cute. And it's the same reason they like older men. They like to feel younger. Anyway, but I think it's always negotiable. That kind of stuff is always negotiable in person. I shouldn't say always, but mostly negotiable in person, based on, as you say, vibes. Like, we can characterize that however you want, but it can be quite situational. And when you ask people the questions on an app, women are aggressively screening, in part because the dynamic on apps is always going to be, as naturally, men kind of going after women and women saying yes, no, yes, no. And if you're in that, like, where you have, let's say 50 applicants for the next week, you're gonna be like, okay, I don't want anybody under 6 feet. It gives women a unjustified sense of endless kind of possibility and endless ability to really screen down men, which, let's face it, like, women love, right? They feel great about themselves when they're like, oh no, like, I get to pick the best men, not you, right? That appeals to the female hindbrain. But the problem is the one that you end up with at the end of that, like, also has a list of 50 women that he's booking for the night. and you're not going to get commitment out of him. And I just feel like in person, these factors align much better and much happier for both sexes on average.
So what do we do? How do we get out of this pickle? Do you see some hope in Gen Z? Is there some, do we just, I don't know, part of like a lot of people who come on this podcast more or less just try to tell people like, to the best of your ability, lean into your agency. I know it sucks out there, but like you still do have some agency despite the societal trends. Like, do you see any space for agency here, whether it's dating? What are we telling people with regard to marriage, having families, this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say something similar, but I'm trying to think of actual pragmatic things. One, I don't think we're getting rid of the apps. I mean, that's just, but maybe try to have a party, like a house party, and have friends bring friends you don't know.
Yeah.
Try to expand your in-person social circle, or something that I think is happening a lot more. If you are in a particular niche online, like meet up with them. Ashley and I met at NatCon in person, and now we're like, we're beginning a wonderful friendship, right? I think there is a lot of utility if you use the online in service of the in-person. It can be a great tool, but if it's just cycling back into itself of only online relationships, basically, that's no good. But find ways to meet up with new people in person, I think would be even if it's not explicitly dating, expand the pool of people that you're in contact with and might vibe with in person. And the other thing is just be more open. This is a agency decision. It's not going to solve any of sort of these global issues or whatever, but be open when you're younger to meeting the person that you might fall in love with, marry, and don't dismiss that because you're in your early 20s, for example. Don't say, oh, like I'm too young for this. It's not to say that like you should bend over backwards, try to make sure you're married off by 25. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, don't, because I feel like a lot of women actually actively suppress, right? They're like, oh, I'm not ready for anything serious. I'm too young. And that is ideology. That is an agency question. That doesn't mean you're going to meet the guy that you like. I don't know. I met the guy I married in my early 20s, and we were stupid. And we just dated for whatever, 4 or 5 years because we were too young to get married, right? That was dumb. Okay. That came to the same outcome in the end, but like, it was stupid. It was a societal messaging thing where young, ambitious, smart people, if you were going to get married at 24 or 25, that was unusual and scary, and so we had to wait till we were in our late 20s, so it would be socially acceptable for us to get married. This is dumb, right? Like if you find somebody who you actually want to make your boyfriend, make a long-term thing, like consider them for marriage, and just do it, right? There's all kinds of studies on the reality that actually like living together for a long time, particularly in certain ways. Brad Wilcox has some really great data on this. He calls it sliding versus deciding. So the percentage of those live-in relationships that turn into marriage and then divorce rates later actually are correlated to whether you slide or decide. Right. So if you're going over at his place a lot, and eventually you have a drawer, and then eventually you have 2 drawers, and then you have like, your toothbrush, and that's sliding because you never actually sit down and make a decision together, even to move in. And then those folks, unfortunately, they slide into after 4 or 5 years, right? They're like, well, we should get married. We've been living together for 4 or 5 years. It's time now. And unfortunately, that locks you into people that you would have otherwise broken up with. Is kind of this sociologist's theory, Brad Wilcox, is that that kind of never actually making a decision. People who decide to move into together actually they have a little bit higher divorce rates than people who don't live together at all. That probably tracks with religiosity. But people who actually like sit down and have a meeting and say like, we would like to move in together as a step towards marriage, that doesn't hurt your divorce rates by very, very much, or doesn't make them higher by very much. It's a conscious decision that you're making together towards like a sort of commitment. Now it's still kind of a half commitment, right? Like I would say at that point, like maybe you should consider getting married. But I realize that I'm like my trad returnness is not actually like helpful to people. But yeah, like be aware of the sliding, because oftentimes the sliding will slide you into somebody you'll slide right into, either wasting, 10, the best sort of most attractive, most fertile 10 years of your life with somebody who's not right for you, or you'll get married to somebody, you'll win the game at the end, but you'll find out that you don't actually want to be married to this person. It's just that you've been raising the barriers to exit so slowly over time that you find yourself in the situation where it was never worth it to leave, because you've melded your stuff, you're now on the same lease, you're on the same like whatever. I mean, you're having now to deal with half of a divorce,
Right.
even though you're not married, and so that raises the barriers to exit. And over time, like that's a very different situation than deciding I want to spend my life with this person. I want to like move forward in a progression of steps in a relationship with them that ends in marriage. So that's what I would say is like increase your in-person pool of people, because I realize that lots of people meet on apps and they have great dates, and they go, start relationships and fall in love and get married. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, because it's clearly the primary way now that people meet. But recognize that there are some very screwed up dynamics in that environment, and expand your pool in person, and then make actual agency decisions about looking for somebody to spend your life with. I mean, I don't know that I'm qualified to be giving any of this advice. I feel like I just got lucky. Like I met a guy I liked pretty much after college, like a year after college, and when I was interning in Washington DC, and he was a staff writer at one of the magazines, and just like hit it off. And then we, like I said, we did this stupid thing where we dated for like 4 or 5 years, even though we pretty much knew we wanted to get married immediately within a year and a half. But it would have been a scandal.
Yes. Well, I mean, what seems
young, upwardly mobile types to marry at age 25.
Yes. So what like really resonates with me is that I think that you like I mean, if I think about my own experience, we met in at a wedding. It was totally like convivial, totally like just vibes. And then we got married younger. We got married at 26, and at that time, it was like I was like a child bride for a lot of my friends who are like highly educated. They were like, oh my God, you're like the first person to get married of our friends. And then after that, like had a child pretty soon after that. And every step along the way, I was like bucking some sort of trend. But if I knew I wanted to, my endpoint was to be married to somebody I liked and didn't want a divorce and to have a family, that was the obvious thing to do. Especially because I wanted to have more than one child, or I wanted to have ideally have the option to have a bigger family, and we have 3 kids. I think it's really important to think when you're young, what is your ultimate end goal, and then think backwards as to how you get there. Like if you really do want to meet someone who you think would be a great husband, I try to think about like where are men congregating? Like when I was like interning in volunteering in politics, I was like, oh man, I could have the pick here. Like there's no women here. Like if I wanted to find a guy, like get involved in politics while you're young, and like they're young, they're ambitious, they're interested in the things that you're interested in.
I think that might be more true on the right than on the left. I feel like actually the earlier part of our conversation, politics on the left is dominated by women.
Yes. So. And then or like somebody was,
if you're a lefty guy, it's probably a great environment.
Yes. Yeah. And then like things like outdoor sports, like I think there are certain sports, like I don't know what, but like there's certain sports that lean in one direction or the other, like you know, put yourself in a situation where you're like, you're going to have good chances. And then don't be afraid to face rejection or try things out, because I think that those skills actually make you pretty resilient for life, as opposed to like never having to face rejection or try at anything. I know it sucks, but like it's still a good thing. And then when I think about specifically, and maybe we can talk about this a bit, marriage and having kids, I basically like dialed back like ambition and career related stuff for a long period when my kids were little, and instead of like putting them in daycare, and that was a very conscious choice, and it was like really frowned upon, especially like I'm, you know, a highly educated, high achieving potential, like, you know, waste of your life basically, is the messaging to like spend your time with your kids when you're little. But I make this argument that like you can think of a period of time in the middle of your life when your kids are really little as just like a mini retirement or a mini dialing back of ambition. And maybe you take a career hit a little bit, but it's worth it. And like it's a very important and meaningful vocation. And I say that in the meantime I was like getting a PhD and publishing a book, but it was just in the in-between hours of you know, I kept my foot in ambition and vocation, but not dialed up to 11, so to speak. So yeah, I wonder if you have thoughts on that, or maybe, you know, guidance for young people with marriage and career, specifically, and children.
Well, I certainly don't have any advice for children. I don't have any. So I want to make one sort of maybe pushback, maybe not, I don't know. When you're talking about the rejection side of things, I do think we're quite, and by we I mean women, we can't really understand how difficult rejection is for men in this environment. Because I mean, especially people I think on the trad sort of side of the spectrum, it's much less personal when the default is no, right, on sex. When the default is no for women, first of all, I think it makes it easier for women to say no, and that's how you end up with those like really, to me, just wild situations where you read about these campus cases where the girl is naked, climbs into bed with a guy, but then decides she doesn't want to have sex with him, but like feels pressured to do it anyway because it would be awkward, right, to say no. I mean, that kind of situation blows my mind, right? We could say that women are more fragile than they used to be, or they're more afraid of, but I actually do, I kind of understand this. I think on the flip side, it's just so much more personal to say no to somebody. It's like, because the default is everybody is having casual sex. That's totally normal.
Right.
And so the default is yes. So now it's like telling somebody, no, you in particular are unattractive to me. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually like way more soul crushing than in an environment where the default is no. Women, you know, then you can just imagine, well, okay, she's not having sex with anybody, like she's looking for something in particular, for like husband material or whatever, even if people weren't actually waiting to have sex until they're married. Like obviously, you know, she's not going to, the vast majority of her answers are going to be no. There's nothing special about me. I feel like now psychologically it's, oh, I don't want to have sex with you in particular, like you, or I will have sex with a lot of different people, but you're just particularly ugly or unattractive or awkward.
Yeah.
And I think that's really personal in a way that it just wasn't before yes became the default. Right. So I have a little sympathy for men, even though I think you're right. Ultimately, like you're going to have to suck it up, and you're going to have to, you know, to be a man is to be on the rejected side of these kinds of advances. That's just biological. But I just have a lot more sympathy for it today than I had, like, say, you know, in a 1953 dating culture, right? Because it's just not that personal. Okay, so you're one of the 99.9% of people who are getting this answer. So but to what you said about the script, right? One of the things that I think has been healthy about the development of kind of, I'm not generally optimistic on Gen Z actually, but I do think one of the things that's been healthy has been a re-questioning of sex positivity. And I think part of that has been a rejection exactly of the lean in mentality. There were these two things were paired together, right? It was like hyper casual sexual life with extreme careerism for women. And I think that has led to a lot of very predictable results. I mean, things that Polya wrote about, things that any church deacon could predict in 1950, but things that we have to endlessly rediscover for ourselves. And I think there is this lie of having it all, right? I actually don't like the right sometimes holds this up, sort of normie right holds this up as well. Like I'm thinking here about the cheering for Amy Coney Barrett, right? Who has whatever 5 kids, biological kids, another 2 adopted, and she sits on the Supreme Court. Yeah. Okay, first of all, before that she had an academic job. If she was working in a firm, that would be impossible, right? So there's just not that many like academic jobs where you can have that amount of flexibility. But also she's clearly a fiend, right? She's clearly a person who was willing to spend every single waking second of her life, and probably a lot of the seconds that she shouldn't have been awake, doing stuff, productive stuff, right? And hey, that's not a model for anyone to not go insane. Like, yes, maybe there's a few Amy Coney Barretts out there, but like it's
not the model. Yeah,
it's not going to be a general model. The reality is what you just said, is that raising kids is a full-time job, and having a job is a full-time job, and you really can't do 2 full-time jobs at the same time. And if you do, one or the other is going to suffer. Yeah. And I think we are, fortunately, moving away a little bit from there's unfortunately it's kind of couched in this feminist backlash, which is why I'm not particularly hopeful, because we're still not looking at the underlying instead we're still not looking at the underlying differences between men and women. What we're looking at are imbalances in chores at home, or stuff like that, talking about the double shift that women pull. And I just still think that's not getting to the actual answer, or the actual, I should even say answer, the actual underlying truth of the matter, upon which we can then try to build an always imperfect like system.
So let's get to that. What is the fundamental truth according to Inez Stepman?
No, this is not according to Inez Stepman. This is according to the left's favorite phrase of the science, that men and women are deeply different. Not just because we have different genitalia and have different times on the 200-meter butterfly, things that we deny even those things, right? That like having a penis makes you a man, and that men are better at the 200-meter butterfly or at the 50 meters dash, okay, because they're faster and stronger. They have, denser bones or whatever. They have more fast twitch muscle fibers. Their upper body strength is vastly superior to that of women. Right. These are things that are completely obvious, and it's astounding that we have reached a point where we deny even these obvious things. Right. But I feel like it's actually just the end of a chain of denying these sex differences that are absolutely observable and then actually provable by science. To the extent, right around 2017, the Academy stopped doing any studies of any worth on this subject, on the differences between men and women, because nobody wanted to fund it or do it. Yeah. But the reality is that even in the womb, you can do a brain scan on a fetus in the womb, and with 90, I can't remember if it's 94 or 96% accuracy, predict the sex of the child. Right. So that's before there's any social influence whatsoever. Male and female brains are different. Men have better binocular vision. Women have better peripheral vision, right? Men can remember better items on a list. They have better memory in sort of a linear fashion. Women can remember items better relational to each other. So one of the memory tests they do is they'll show you a room where there's like a lamp and a teddy bear and a table, right? And women are better at saying, after you take away the picture, the lamp was next to the teddy bear, was next to the duvet, right? Yeah. Women are much better at remembering like the relationship of objects to each other than men are, but men can remember more items on a list, right? And then those things fall into essentially those brain differences translate in different biological imperatives, translate into different psychological profiles for men and women. And this is not even controversial in terms of the data.
No.
There's a reason that in psychiatry, right, in the psychiatric manual, there are a series of disorders that are associated with women and a series of disorders that are associated with men, which is not to say that there are no, BPD men, but like it's there's a reason that these things. And actually, Louise Perry was, and I think she was quoting someone else. I'm gonna have to find out who, but she told me the difference is quite like faces, right? With psychological traits, any one trait, there's a skew towards men or women, but like there are lots of exceptions. It's not like it really is a spectrum, right? So for example, big noses, okay? Men generally on average have bigger noses than women, but there are lots of examples of women with big noses, right? Same thing with like having I have a sharp jawline, right? That's generally a masculine trait, but there are lots of women with sharp jawlines, like me, and then Olivia Wilde, the much prettier version. Okay, any given one of these traits is not very strongly identified. It's happens more in women than men, or vice versa, but is not like super. A cluster of traits and a face with 99.9% accuracy, you can immediately identify if it's a man or a woman, right? Because of the particular combination, they're actually, each one of these traits by itself, not super predictive of sex, but the clusters of traits together, extremely highly predictive of sex.
Yeah.
Right? You can almost always look at somebody and tell immediately if they're male or female. And when you can't, it bothers your brain, by the way. I don't know, it's just me. I can't stop thinking about it for 10 minutes when I see someone, like, is that a man or a woman? I can't stop thinking about it. But so that's enormous predictivity overall. So psychological traits are the same way, right? You can have an individual psychological trait. There are men who are more nurturing, are more relationship oriented, but they have a bunch of other masculine traits. And if you give a collection of traits with very, very high accuracy, we can predict whether that's a man or a woman who has that collection of psychological traits. So our sex differences don't stop at the neck, right? We're deeply different in the brain and psychological elements, and that is who we are, right? Sex is very, very not definitive, but deeply predictive of who we are. And so what we do with that fact, that's a big, debate, but I don't think this is according to Inez Stepman. I think this is very, very difficult to refute if anybody is honest about the data and frankly about their everyday observations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and I think, well, just bringing it back to the things that I study, I think there is a leaning into, embracing nature in some sense, like, our biology is our human nature. And I think there is like a sense, if we think about environmental issues, where we're really just trying to, with industrial society, we're basically just trying to bend nature to our will and not paying attention to like how nature works. I think the same thing is true here, where we're trying to bend our internal nature to some sort of will to fit this like industrial society. And then we're backloading the reasons why. And we're trying to make, everybody automatons, as opposed to, and I think what you do with that, I'd like to lean into a little bit before we end, but as opposed to thinking about using our fundamental nature in a way that's good for everybody. I think about having been pregnant and breastfeeding is like the most extreme example of this, where it's like, I'm a woman and I'm the only one in our family who can do this. And that there are certain things that flow from that. I have to pull back from other ways in which I could just like slot in easily into industrial society to be able to do those tasks, being pregnant and breastfeeding. And then on the flip side, my husband has to lean into like different masculine virtues to be able to take care of the house and the family and the property, so that I'm able to like lean into my biological reality. And so that kind of puzzle piece relationship actually is better for everybody, as opposed to either outsourcing pregnancy or outsourcing nursing, or, you know, so that I can be just like a man, and then expect my husband, you know, for example, to like do all of the feeding of my babies by a bottle or something like that, which is, it's really just like sort of muscling nature into some you know, a more controlled way of you know, getting the outcomes we want for industrial society, when and I think there's just a lot of negative outcomes from that, where we're just like, you know, we're feeling lonely, we're feeling a loss of meaning in life, and, you know, without going too trad, I think there's a way in which we could like lean into the nature, lean into the biology to I mean, I just think of like, I don't know, this is like maybe too woo-woo for Inez, but like, I think of like being a beautiful maiden, and then, you know, you have this beautiful period of fertility, and then parlaying that into like beautiful motherhood, and then you have this wisdom that comes from motherhood, and that eventually turns into like this crone role, where you're wise, and you're sort of like making relationships between everybody in the community, and you're making the community work well by leaning into your feminine capacities, if that makes sense.
You know, I certainly think we need to bring back the role of the crone in our society. I think that we need places for older women. Ironically, like a obsession with, frankly, with sex and attractiveness leads us to like disregard everything else, and instead we have older women chasing the role of the maiden for like a very long time, right? And it ends up in kind of uncanny valley terrifying territory.
Yes.
Where like you don't know from the back that because a woman is dressed like she's 22, and then she turns around and she's like 55, and it's like, you know. Like I think we're all chasing that because it makes sense that we would. I mean, first of all, women are vain, and this is fine. Like we're not gonna, it's not fun to like lose the sort of sexual power that you have. So it's not that I find it not understandable, but it's just we also don't have any places for women to go after that, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like everybody's now an actress in Hollywood, and so everyone is similarly terrified of getting old, right? As somebody whose entire sort of life depends on remaining attractive.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case in most societies or most human history, but I think we can't lean into the biology until we admit it exists, and we're afraid to admit it exists because we're afraid it's going to be determinative, right? And look, maybe that fear is accurate, but I tend to think that it's not determinative fully, at least. And I think one of the reasons we're so afraid of it is because we've lost the distinction between culture and counterculture, or in other words, we have lost our appreciation for weirdos. And when every trait has to be celebrated by society, or it doesn't exist, or it's oppressed completely, there's no room for counterculture. I mean, Paulia writes very convincingly about this, right? About there's this great article that she wrote about a Madonna video, like on MTV or whatever in the early 90s. And she wrote a piece for the New York Times back when the New York Times was publishing things that were interesting. And she basically, so MTV banned this music video because it was like S&M based, and it was too sexual for TV, for prime time. Those were the days. Anyway, so they banned it, and Paulia famously loved Madonna, thought she, you know, was the greatest sort of feminine archetype, right? And so I think they commissioned her to write something criticizing MTV for banning this video by Madonna. But what she actually wrote was a column saying this is a magnificent piece of pornography, of like erotic art. It absolutely should not be on MTV, right? It should not be available to the mainstream. It should be showing basically in a seedy, like underground yeah, art house with like whatever. I don't want to go too much into like the imagination of where, but she essentially is like, there's a role for this. It's an important role. It produces a lot of great art. It keeps the erotic, but it can never be mainstream. It's very bad for it to be mainstream. And I feel like we've totally lost that. I mean, that was just about a particular kind of sexuality, but I feel like we've lost that. We're so terrified that our biological differences are going to be determinative.
Right.
And we've totally lost the ability to say, well, maybe we should order society in accordance with these facts of nature about men and women. And then we should like essentially leave room for weirdos to do something else. Right. And that, but society does have a script. I do not believe in this libertarian thing where it's like everybody's just going to be individualistic. We're going to pretend that sex is kind of a neutral factor, because this is what feminism has been saying, not just now, but for 100 years. Your sex should not be indicative of what you do for a living. It shouldn't be indicative of the choices that you make about family and career. It should not be indicative of your politics. It should not be indicative of your friendships, right? There's no difference between men and women. We should all treat each other as perfectly genderless automatons, right? And if it doesn't matter for your life, your marriage, your decisions about forming a family, your job, your career, if you have one, your relationships, then okay, so then it's irrelevant, right? Then okay, then let's let Leah Thomas swim the 200-meter butterfly against biological women, because we've already made sex irrelevant to everything important in life, and now we're freaking out because it's now being applied to the least irrelevant things in life, right? Like for most people, swimming the 200-meter butterfly, much less important than decisions about family and career, right? So once you've already conceded the big stuff, it seems inevitable to me that we would end up here. And I think we're just so terrified of putting forward a script that says, yes, we should expect women to, for example, do what you did. The societal script should be, if you want to have a family, you're going to have to drop out of the workforce or functionally going to have to drop out of the workforce for a certain number of years.
Or a decade, depending on how many kids you have. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is just how it is. That should be the societal script. Now, then somebody like Amy Coney Barrett can do her thing, and she can be a weirdo, and she will be the only woman in that kind of career, because there are careers you can't drop out for 10 years.
Yeah.
And return, right? So like, we have to just make that the default, and then accept that there are going to be exceptions and weirdos, and like that's fine, right? And I don't believe we can have no default, because the default we have right now is exactly what you referred to. It's the pressure. It's a life script. It's, if you're bright, competent, ambitious as a woman, you're going to, not only you're going to finish high school, you're going to go immediately into college. Okay. So then you're 22, then you're going to take an internship or a first job somewhere, probably usually in a different place in the country. You're going to move across the country to take something. You're going to work there for a couple of years. Then maybe you'll go to grad school or law school or whatever. We have a script that basically gives women a very small window in which to find a partner, marry, and have children. And a lot of women are not going to, like, that's too much pressure to put on 4 years.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people won't find somebody in 4 years, you know what I mean? But if you've been searching since you were 22, you have 14 years to do that. And I think we should normalize making choices that way. Yeah. But I think we're too scared of the idea that the spreadsheets won't show that we're the same. Well, the reality is we aren't the same, and we shouldn't expect it. We should embrace and love the pay gap, because it just reflects something different about us.
Yeah, totally. And I love this, just to highlight this point, that the sort of ends of the bell curve, the extremes, are like determining the middle in a way that is itself oppressive in an opposite extreme of like biological determinism. There has to be a middle point, I don't want to force women to be, mothers or wives if they don't want to be. I don't want to like determine this, but if this is a goal of women, and it is for many, the other extreme saying, there is no sex difference, you should be able to be like Amy Coney Barrett, be a girl boss extreme, forces a different kind of control, a different kind of alienation. Like I know of peers who kept high-powered careers and want to have kids too, and are getting to work and dropping their kids off at 6 a.m. at daycare and picking them up at 7 p.m. and not sleeping at night. And it's really insane if they're trying to have it all. And I think it's just forcing people in an opposite direction. That's not it's not fruitful, it's not meaningful, and I think it's harming people in another direction. And I think there's got to be a middle ground. And I really like what you said about there's the middle of the bell curve. Society should protect that, but then there needs to be spaces where we're tolerant of weirdos, but the weirdos need to be we don't need to put it all on MTV or whatever the modern equivalent of MTV is.
The weirdos have to accept being weirdos, right? You have to accept that there are going to be things that you do that are not praised or supported by society, and that's fine. Like that is actually the essence of freedom. Right. But I do want to push back. I know we're wrapping up here, but I want to push back on something you said. We don't want to force anyone into this particular track, wife, motherhood.
Yeah.
Somebody who doesn't want that. And I agree, obviously, on the face of it. Like I don't want to put a gun to somebody's head, right? But I do think what you want it's not determined as like a brain in a vat, right? This is the same era of psychology. I think that when we talk about in the transgender context, like who you are, as though that is totally separated from both biology and from the influence of the society in which you're raised and the family in which you're raised, that most people don't know who they are. And it turns out that a lot of people in our society, I think there's probably a very high percentage of women who said that it's who they are at 22, but they never want to get married, never want to have kids. And at 37, they have very opposite opinions about that.
Yeah.
And they're going to be really upset about it. And so I think that our society actually should be pushing people in this direction, not in a fully coercive way. Again, I don't want to put a gun to anybody's head, but I think it's good to have a societal script that actually encourages that, because at the end of the day, in a couple decades, that is actually what most women end up wanting, and they feel regret and they feel lonely without it, and they feel and I feel like loneliness is the killer of our age, right? And so I think it's fine that society, quote unquote, pushes you into a particular track. God knows we're pushing women into a particular track now,
right?
It's just not a track that is going to leave most of them like fulfilled and happy in life.
Yeah. And I should clarify, a couple of times I've had this argument on Twitter, and somebody says, I say, more or less like, when little babies, infants need their mothers. And then somebody will write back, well, what if a mother doesn't want to be with their baby? And I just think like, well, that's just not okay. Like you shouldn't really have that choice, honestly. Like, or society, and put more gently, society should make some sort of container for you to be able to be with your infant under 6 weeks, under 3 months. Like, this is just an obvious biological need. And so, I think, but then, we don't want to go so far in the direction where it's like, maybe there's family pressure where you're like chained to the home. You're not expected to do anything outside of the home. Like your only vocation is being with your kids. There's extremes in both directions. And I feel like it's okay to be somewhere in the middle, and there's like no political home for those of us who think that, it's like, it's okay to have some vocation, have some ambition, but not at the expense of your own nature and the nature of having a family and the needs of children. Okay, so this was wonderful. Any last thoughts? We've solved the problem of the battle of the sexes. Any last thoughts before we go?
No, last thoughts. I think we're gonna have to work this out.
that's the only, I mean, or we'll be replaced by a civilization that does.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, fundamentally, like,
the world goes on, right?
yeah,
With or
I
without
mean,
us.
if we want to replace ourselves, and have the civilization that, you know, it only keeps going with, you know, the managing the battle of the sexes, having families, having children, passing on our culture. We can't eradicate the other side, like you said. So
Yeah, that's the Simone de Beauvoir is optimistic. She saw it as a great tragedy, but we can end with it as an optimistic
I love that.
element.
Yes,
That
repurposing that.
there can be no victor in the battle of the sexes.
No, we have to work together, which is good. And I think it requires quite a bit of nuance and leaning into our fundamental natures, but in a way that I think could be really beautiful, and joyful and meaningful for people. And I think that's what they're seeking anyway. So good optimistic note to end on. How can people find you or follow your work, Inez?
Sure. You can find my work at iwf.org along with that of my colleagues. I also am a terminally online person on Twitter. You can find me. You can type in Inez Stepman, but my @handle is INEZ Inez Feltscher, F as in Frank, ELTSCHER. That's my maiden name. I guess I can maybe change it now. I haven't changed my Twitter handle because I had a blue check and I didn't. Once you change your handle, like you have to reapply for it, and there was no way I was going to get it again. But now I think it's you have the Twitter blue thing, and Elon Musk is just gonna. So maybe I can actually change my handle. But you can type in Inez Stepman, you'll get it.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. This was awesome.